What's going on, Quantum Nation? Welcome back. My name is Quantum, and today we're going to be talking about the TCL Q7. Now, it's a good TV. I definitely recommend it, so that's the short answer. Smack a like on this video for just getting to the point, not wasting your time, right? So we're going to dive a little bit deeper and talk about why that is, and we're going to start with the more nerdy scientific part of things. So on the lower end of the accuracy spectrum, we have 3.8 as far as our delta error goes for our grayscale, which is not great, but it's okay, right? Though the biggest errors can be seen at a max of 5.2. Now that was granted in just 95% grayscale, but honestly speaking, it's still a very high error, so you're going to need to calibrate this thing either way. Now, fortunately, color is, I guess, pretty good from an accuracy standpoint with an average delta error of 2.3, which is imperceptible to the human eye. However, you do have some error where you have the max being 3.8, and that's where we have the issue because that is going to run into more of perceptible territory. But again, like all TVs, again, you will have to calibrate this out of the box. Now, fortunately, I've created some beast settings for you for $5. You join the membership and you don't have to worry about all that stuff. Unlock your TV and see what it can do, I'm telling you. It's a whole different tier of television, which you'll probably see from some of the footage in this video, no doubt. But that being said, we're going to talk about some more of the finer aspects. So when we talk about the DCI-P3 color coverage, it's sitting at 94%, which is a bit dated. 95 is usually a minimum I would recommend for a QLED television. Anything lower than that, we're getting into low-end territory as far as quantum dot coverage. Now, that's to be expected given the price point. They usually do stuff like this, but that is not fantastic. Now, the BT 2020 color coverage is under 70 at 69%, which again, very low. And again, for my scientific guys out there, you guys can appreciate these kinds of specs and just seeing how it really all kind of comes together, right? Now, fortunately, it's pretty good for local dimming. So the native contrast ratio without any local dimming enabled is going to be 5299 to 1. So that's not bad, just shy of 5300 to 1, and that's going to give you, again, a decent darkroom experience. However, the issue does become a little bit more exasperated when we get to turning on local dimming for smaller windows of peak brightness, which I'll talk about in a second here, but the black levels are fantastic at an astronomical 657,000 plus to 1 contrast ratio. So needless to say, you aren't struggling in a dark room to get inky black levels, which is why it can have a near OLED feel to it. Now, what I was talking about when I said that there is a bit of an issue, it is hyper-aggressive in terms of the way it goes about dimming. So you'll notice that on the lowest spectrum of things, you'll find that you're going to be in the 200s even for local dimming on your 1 and 2% windows of peak brightness because it's not trying to allow you to see any bloom. Now, personally, I prefer this method of when you have small logos, typically found in the 1% and 2% windows of peak brightness, it dims that stuff down so that you don't have disgusting blooming, versus other approaches from some other brands that usually show all of that stuff. So I don't really think this is a negative, but what I do think is a negative is the fact that this is not reaching the 1000 nits of peak brightness that it advertised. Instead, the most I got was just a little over 800. It's not really a whole lot more than that, and that is very disappointing given they are advertising 1000 nits on this particular model, and it didn't exactly hit that, so you can't really expect that. Also, the average peak brightness sustained is around 550 nits, so not fantastic. And in addition to that, you do have a pretty decent full screen brightness, or 100% window of peak white. And that's going to come in at 655, a little over that. Give or take, it'll come up and down, but you're in the 600s, Will, so that's pretty good. Now, unfortunately, the input lag isn't the best I've ever seen. In my testing, I got 25 milliseconds, which frankly could be better. Again, this is for 1080-60, so it does go lower as you go up into resolutions like 4K, 60 FPS, and things like that. It'll eventually go down lower, but again, it is still something to note that there are better options as far as input lag on the market, but this still is very responsive and you shouldn't have many problems. One thing I did find particularly weird is I couldn't find the actual dedicated game mode preset, so I think that's pretty weird. Usually these TVs come built in with a game mode preset of some sort, but this one seems to like just omit that altogether. I just don't know why they wouldn't just have a default.
In terms of color on the TCL, just looking at content, it's pretty amazing. I mean, like, the amount of detail that kicks up contrast-wise off of this thing gets to a point where it just kind of feels ridiculous at some points, where you're like, You know, it feels like a more expensive TV than what it is. But then there are some disappointing moments, like when we were just at that scene with the sun kind of blasting through the tree line and stuff like that, how it doesn't really feel like you're experiencing like a truly premium television because the brightness never really keeps up. Now, they are good at highlight placement, though, and what I mean by highlight placement is where there should be a really strong pop to something, it is there, especially like, again, highlights like sun reflecting off of buildings and things like that. Those highlights or the placement of those highlights is generally really good. Now, that doesn't mean that they always get it perfect. Again, when you get to smaller windows of peak brightness, that's kind of where it's underwhelming. But overall, the aesthetic does look pretty good, as you can clearly see in this scene. Now, the near black performance as well is pretty decent in that you don't have a whole lot of shadow crushing or things that just look generally unappealing that makes you want to walk away from the TV and say, you know what, I've had it. This is just not good for me. Also, even though it's a little bit dated as far as the color, it still can produce a really vibrant image if you put the effort into it and create some masterful settings like I've done here. You can get some absolutely wonderful results. Now, this obviously does revolve around you going way beyond reference standards and even what's recommended by a lot of the industry purists, but you can get a brilliant result either way. I think this particular demo will show you just how clean black levels can be, and that it's really looking a lot like an OLED. Now, I can tell you it's not perfect, obviously, off at an angle or things like that, but sitting in front of it, especially if you've never owned an OLED before, you would really not have that itching desire to go run out and buy one again because of the astronomical contrast ratio, combined with the way they've programmed local dimming to really focus on highlights where they need to be and not over brightening for the sake of just giving you the shock and awe value of a really bright TV. And I've got to say, I really appreciate this method because when you do it this way, you really set yourself up to get what I believe to be an accurate image that just asks to be seen, right? Like, I'm looking at every little color, every little nuanced detail, the vibrancy, it all just looks good. And another really good thing about TCL this year is how they've really gone the extra mile as far as motion. So as all the effects are popping off behind these models, you're not noticing the typical artifacts or motion artifacts that you would have on other TVs that maybe don't try as hard from some of the competing manufacturers, which again, I think is really good given the price point, which oftentimes goes missed and almost just straight up not mentioned in these scenarios. In relatively well-lit scenes, highlight placement can be absolutely glorious, as you're seeing here in the sky. It's not the brightest you've ever seen, but it's really sharp, and that sharpness gives just such a different feel to the environment, as you're seeing here in the sunset over the city, as Spider-Man gets ready to jump off of the little perch that he's on and take to his web-swinging antics. I'm going to tell you right now, it feels just so good to see and to watch as you're looking at just how deep the black levels are. It gives that 3D look, and this TV often has a feeling of having a very three-dimensional look to it. Even in HDR, though not bright or really bright, it's still really impressive. And also notice how when he's swinging through the cities, you don't have crazy artifacts all over the place, and it is generally a smooth experience. And again, from a motion perspective, this is the kind of stuff that we appreciate and really like. Now, it's not always going to be a perfect display of motion every single time, but generally speaking, motion is probably one of the best, if not the best, you'll probably find in class, and definitely in price point. Because even when you start going upwards of several $1,000s even, motion just starts getting worse if you start going with certain brands. A particular brand that's not very good for motion is Sony. Now, we have to mention Sony because they're seen often as the top dog when we talk about televisions, and from a processing perspective, they're really good at that, and they produce beautiful, vivid imagery with awesome clarity. But the problem is that they are falling behind the times in terms of fluidity, and action scenes like this on PS5 is going to fall behind. So in terms of gaming, I know Sony likes to say that they're perfect for PS5 with all of their TVs, but honestly speaking, TCL is way better in terms of what you're getting visually, because an image that is stationary being, fantastic is kind of useless when we're talking about televisions, which is a glorified talking painting. And at the end of the day, this is doing a phenomenal job of presenting not just the pop, not just the 3D shock and awe, but also giving us the fluid motion behind it with the inky deep black levels. Now, yes, brightness could be brighter, and some Sonys definitely can take the edge there, and processing, again, is not going to be as strong as you're going to find on some Sony TVs. But honestly speaking, that honestly doesn't matter, because when you look at the image quality that TCL has presented for the price point, it more than makes up for any shortcomings that you'll come across, and I think that's going to be something to mention as you start looking around and going into Best Buys and trying to compare maybe what you should buy over something else. Spoiler warning, but for my anime crowd out there, I did want to point out that, well, honestly speaking, you are going to have a bit of an issue when we talk about expecting super vibrant colors out of the anime. Again, that's because of that 94% DCI-P3 color coverage, which honestly doesn't give us a whole lot, and frankly speaking, it is going to be a little bit more underwhelming than some other TVs. Now, from a processing standpoint as well, if you're streaming, this is where something like a Sony will come into much better of an offering than what TCL can, because this is just a little bit blurry and fuzzy by comparison, where Sony's would be super sharp and very, very clear, especially on lower bitrate content. That was a focus that Sony had that TCL unfortunately just isn't at that level yet in terms of processing. Not on this particular model anyway. The QM8 was pretty good, but it still also had its problems. So processing is very much still something that the entry-level brands, as they try to call them, budget brands, as they try to call them, are going to have to work on, matching the AI processing of absolute top-tier brands. But in terms of quality, as you can clearly see, it looks absolutely amazing. But yeah, so when you're watching One Piece and you're watching the whole Gear 5 episodes or whatever you're doing on whatever anime sites you want, this is definitely going to be something that's going to catch your eye, but not going to be better than the competition, because they've got some work to do here.
So as you can clearly see, this is an amazing TV that offers a lot for the money. I think, honestly speaking, if you're really trying to get excellent black levels in a dark room, but you really don't want to break the bank, this is truly one of the no-brainer options this year. Color is a bit dated again. We have 94% of DCI-P3, which puts you in 2017 and 2016 territory of performance. And honestly, there are some 2015 TVs that could outperform this in terms of quantum dot color coverage. So that is pretty underwhelming. That is something you do have to consider, because the color already out the gate is dated by at least a few years. So that's not the greatest part about it. If you're more of a color person, I would keep hunting and look around for something just a bit better. But overall, it is a good TV. Not the brightest again. It needs work there, but it delivers an acceptable result that a lot of people will be impressed with, especially those who are on a bit more of a budget and maybe just want a TCL. But that being said, I want to hear what you guys think in the comments down below. I want to thank you for watching the #1 brand in honesty. Till the next video, I'll see you guys later.